The subject of trans athletes in sport was recently thrust into the spotlight again when FINA, the international federation responsible for overseeing elite swimming and other aquatic sports, effectively banned transgender women from competing alongside other women. Now, this move, ostensibly made in the name of protecting fairness, has been championed by many, including former Olympic swimmer Sharron Davies. However, the aim of this video is to deconstruct whether or not this really is a fair decision, and if you're a cis person who's neutral on the matter, hopefully it will open your mind to the fact there is a lot more nuance to the subject than the likes of Davies would have you believe. Whenever the issue of trans inclusion in sport comes up, it's always frustrating, because it's a deceptively complex and multi-layered topic which inevitably gets treated very reductively within mainstream discourse, both online and in the media. It doesn't help that, as with any discussion involving trans rights or trans people's lives, there are bigots seeking to derail the conversation at every turn. More on that later. And so consequently, the issue always gets boiled down to, should trans people, or more specifically trans women, be allowed to compete in women's sport, yes or no, without any acknowledgement of the various ways in which trans athletes can be accommodated, or the level of the sport in question, or any of the other wider context we're going to be unpacking today. Now, when framed in this crude, oversimplified manner, I can see how the answer might seem pretty cut and dry. Trans women were born male, so therefore they have an unfair advantage over other women due to their sexual characteristics. Now, this isn't necessarily true, especially depending on how far into their transition those women are, but for the sake of argument, and as a way into this complex subject matter, let's start from that point as a base assumption. Firstly, we should acknowledge that whether or not sexual characteristics really make a difference, and to what extent, does depend on what sport we are talking about. For instance, in motor racing, it is generally acknowledged that sex doesn't make any significant difference, and there's no reason someone assigned female at birth shouldn't be able to compete with someone assigned male at birth. Therefore, I don't see any way you could begin to argue from a place of good faith that a trans woman should be barred from competing in the W Series category, for instance, regardless of what point in her transition she is at. There are probably better examples, but as a motorsport fan, it's what immediately springs to mind. Secondly, as I alluded to earlier, we also need to consider what level of sport we are talking about. You may remember a little while ago a bunch of people got very outraged on Twitter after the Daily Mail covered a cycling race where trans women came in first and second places. What most of those people failed to mention is that it was a low-level, non-professional, unsanctioned event, and that Jo Smith, the cis woman who came in third, whom transphobes were projecting their victim complexes onto, actually praised the solidarity and respect shown between all competitors, and also spoke critically of the Daily Mail for using a race they would never have covered under any normal circumstances to fuel an agenda. All of which begs the question of, is fairness really that important in amateur sports, where the majority of participants are not professional athletes and it's the taking part as opposed to the winning that counts, or should inclusivity take priority over all else? I'm not saying I hold all of the answers here, but it's a dimension of the conversation that must be considered. But let's say we are discussing professional top-level sport, and it's the kind of sport where being assigned male at birth could be advantageous. Well, setting aside whether or not someone is trans, there are other ways in which one athlete can have a natural physical advantage over another. For instance, I think it's fair to say that having longer legs gives you an advantage in sprinting, and yet there are no calls being made to ban women with long legs from participating. Which leads on to the bigger question of, why do we segregate sport by gender in the first place? This is a point which doesn't get brought up nearly enough, and certainly it should be addressed if we're going to have the conversation about trans athletes, because arguably this notion of having men's sport and women's sport is itself somewhat archaic, and is more a reflection of historical sexist gender division than anything to do with fairness. If that was really the aim, then surely it would make more sense to segregate based on physical attributes that are relevant to the sport in question, whether that be height, weight, or testosterone count, as opposed to something as arbitrary as sex or gender. But this is where we encounter a problem, namely that most of the people fueling the discourse about trans athletes are doing so in bad faith and are actually not interested in fairness at all, just like how transphobes who talk about women's rights don't actually care about women's rights. You can tell this from the fact that it's almost always trans women who are seen as the issue, even though by the same logic trans men are at an unfair disadvantage, and you'd think that if this was really all about fairness and equality, that would be quite an important consideration, not to mention that there is practically no mainstream acknowledgement of non-binary people and how best to accommodate their needs. I lose track of the amount of times I've heard variations of the words "trans people are ruining sport," as though it is somehow trans people's fault just for existing and wanting to be included. And that's ultimately what it's all about. As with so many things, it's the very fact of trans people just existing and participating and being successful that is the problem. If you're still not convinced about how laden with bigotry the topic is, then consider the fact that Sharron Davies, the Olympic swimmer we briefly mentioned in the intro, who praised the decision to exclude trans women and is now calling for similar bans from other sporting bodies, has among other things argued that LGBTQ issues should not be taught in schools and compared drag to blackface. Like, what the hell, Sharron? She also made this gloriously garbled tweet about two biological females on an island, which honestly deserves its own separate video. We'll definitely cover that one sometime. If you think all of this isn't relevant, it absolutely is, because people like Davies are able to get their voices heard and taken seriously by shielding their bigotry under the guise of fairness in sport or protecting women, and that is how we end up in a situation like this. I hope the two main points of this essay are clear, that trans inclusion in sport is an extremely complex subject and not one which necessarily has an easy quick fix solution, and that outright banning a whole set of women from being able to compete with other women is not the right way to go about it. It isn't fair and it certainly isn't feminist. For further reading, I highly recommend you go watch Jessie Gender's video on transgender athletes in sport, which I will link on screen now, as she covers many of the same points from the perspective of a trans person and also elaborates and goes into a lot more depth than I have here, so do be sure to check out that video. I'm Midnight and I just lost my train of thought.